seems like no matter what, no matter how good you are, no matter how much good you try to do, no matter how many things that you try to do to live right, no matter how much money you have in the bank, life is always going to find some way to punch you right in the mouth. Starting the sermon off on a real downer, right? All of us face times in our lives where it feels like everything around us has just collapsed. The life we've built is just gone. It's decimated. Something happens, whether we choose it or not, and it just kind of destroys everything around us. Again, these are things that maybe are results of decisions that we've made. Maybe they're just things that are forced upon us. I'll leave you to decide which one you think is worse, but whatever it is, it just decimates everything around us, and it leaves us feeling empty and hollow and wondering how we're supposed to carry on from this. It could have been some poor financial decision that you made that now has left your family's future in jeopardy. It could have been some ne'er-do-well took it upon themselves to steal your identity, and it wasn't discovered until the damage was done. It could be that maybe the doctor's report came back in, and the outlook wasn't positive. Maybe it was when a loved one left this earth far too soon. Maybe it was bad decisions. Maybe it just happened. Every one of us experiences times in our lives where it feels like everything has just crashed. And we're left wondering, what do I do now? We know that pain. We know that confusion. But when we face these particularly difficult times in our lives, we really have about two different options that we can have. At least that's what I could come up with, was two different choices that we can make in those particular times. We can either let the pain and the hurt and the anger and the frustration overtake us to the point that we never really move beyond it. We never move forward with our lives because we're so focused on that pain. It has affected us so deeply that we refuse to move past it. Or we try to make the best of the situation. We try to work beyond that point, to take whatever situation we find ourselves in, again, whether chosen or not chosen, and somehow make the best of it. I'll be honest with you, I kind of wish that I could tell you that every single time in my life it's been the second one. My life has collapsed around me several times, like all of us it has. I'd like to tell you that I've picked the second one every single time, but I'm not sure that that'd be 100% honest. But I really respect those people who are able to do that, those people who are able to take these terrible situations thrust upon them and turn them into something good, the people who life gives them lemons and they make the best lemonade you've ever had before. Those are the people that I respect the most. And it's probably why the story of Joseph is one that I come back to time after time after time in my own life. Because Joseph, throughout his life really, has all kinds of things just happen around him, that most of which are not his decision. They're not a result of things that he did wrong. If anything, he did everything right, and still life collapsed around him. Take, for instance, our text today in Genesis 39. We're going to be in verses 1 through 12. So go ahead and turn there. We're going to get there in just a few minutes. But by the time we get to this point, nobody has had quite a major collapse of fortune as Joseph. I mean, up until this point, his life is pretty idyllic. It's a wonderful existence. He is the son of a father who loves him dearly. His family has great wealth and notoriety. He's a part of what was becoming a family tradition of respected men who had this intertwined relationship with God. His father loved him, doted on him always. He knew that he was destined for great things, and even his dreams seemed to indicate that even better things were on the horizon for him. Everything about Joseph's life up to this particular point was fantastic. I mean, sure, his brothers weren't exactly fans of his, and he kind of knew that, but he never thought anything would happen because of that. But that all changed last week. I mean, all Joseph was doing was what his dad had asked him to do. His father asked him, go and check on your brothers as they're shepherding the herd. It was supposed to be a simple chore. Probably one of the easiest ones that Joseph would ever be given. Just go and check on them. That's it. By the time he finally caught up to them after 3 days of walking, something was different. His brothers surrounded him. And in a flash, they grabbed him. They ripped the robe his father had given him, that symbol of his dad's love and affection for him, that very special gift that meant the world to Joseph. They tore it from him. He did his best to kind of struggle in that moment, not sure of what's going on around him, but there were 10 of them. And they overpowered him. They carried him off, they pushed him, they shoved him. And finally they threw him into a deep, dark pit. He was confused. He was willing to be honest, he was more than a little scared. As he sat there in this deep, dark pit with the only source of light being what little light was coming in through the hole that he entered in, he wondered what was next. He tried to understand what had just happened, what just took place around him. He nursed his wounds while also trying to figure out how to handle these emotional wounds that he just experienced. Finally, after a few hours of sitting in this dark pit, he began to hear the voices of his brothers coming near him. It was all just a joke, he thought. He breathed that sigh of relief, albeit it was a joke that Joseph did not get. But maybe things would kind of be a little less rocky with his brothers after this. Maybe, just maybe, they'd lighten up on him a little bit, and their relationship could get a little better. He tried his best to smile as they pulled him out of the pit, so it at least looked like he was a good sport for this particular joke. But as he blinked his eyes with the sudden influx of light that hit him, he began to realize it wasn't just his brothers that were there. There were a few guys that Joseph had never seen before. And his brother Judah was talking with one of these guys, while his other brothers still refused to let go of him. When Judah had finished talking, he came back over and he said, "Well, we've agreed on a price." Joseph didn't understand exactly what that meant. But then one of these strange men walked up to him, and before he realized what was going on, he was tied. His hands were bound together, and he was being led away, taken away from his brothers, from his family, being led away by these strange men that he had never seen in his life before. It took him a little while, but eventually it clicked in his head. What Judah had said, what's happening now, it all made sense all of a sudden. I've just been sold. His brothers just sold him like they would have sold one of the sheep. As he walked and continued down this path, he couldn't understand why they would have done this sort of thing. I mean, sure, he never really got along with his brothers. They never really seemed to give him the time of day. He kind of sensed that maybe they were a little jealous of him, but he never thought they'd take things this far. Because now he's being taken away from everything he's ever known. A realization hits him. I'm never going to see my dad again. As they continue to walk, he asks one of the men, "Where are we going?" "Egypt," his captors say. That is so far away from home. Joseph had never been to Egypt. He'd heard stories about his great-grandfather Abraham's time in Egypt, and it wasn't exactly always positive. He had listened as travelers would talk about this foreign land, this, at the time, a mega power in the world, this wealth and this powerful nation known as Egypt. And now Joseph realized, I'm going to see it firsthand, but not because I made the decision to. It's already intimidating enough to move to an area where you don't know anybody, let alone to do it when it's not your choice. It took about a week for Joseph and his captors to make their way to Egypt. It's a very long walk. And after that time, Joseph has had some opportunities to process a little bit of what's going on here, but it still just doesn't add up to him. He's still confused and scared, and you know what? Probably a little angry that his brothers would do this sort of thing to him, that they'd sell him off like a piece of livestock. He wondered about what his dad thought. All he could picture in his mind was his father staying up every night worried about him. He couldn't tell his dad what really had gone on. Finally, when we get to our text today in Genesis 39, Joseph is brought into Egypt, and in a fairly short amount of time, he is processed and he finds himself being sold, albeit to a fairly important man. Genesis 39 verse 1 says, "Now Joseph had been taken to Egypt. An Egyptian named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and a captain of the guards, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there." Now, as far as new bosses go, Joseph probably could have done a lot worse. Potiphar, being one of the people who's in the court of Pharaoh, has the ear of the leader of this entire nation. He's wealthy, he's important, he's got influence as captain of the guard. He's somebody who commands respect of everybody around him. Joseph is probably not the first servant he's ever bought, and it's probably not going to be the last one he ever bought. So Joseph is taken away by this powerful man, and he's brought into his household to serve him as a slave. Now again, his life has changed in an unbelievably dramatic way. If you think about where he was just a week ago, being beloved by his father in a fairly prominent family whose whole life was intertwined in this relationship with the God of the universe. Joseph had had dreams about what a great and important man he would wind up being, that God had given him these dreams, that one day he was going to be somebody who commanded respect, but where are those dreams now? See, Joseph's the new guy in this household. He's the new servant. And the new servants, they're not exactly given the cushy office jobs. They're given the jobs that nobody wants to do. They're given the dirty jobs, the disgusting jobs, the jobs that you are thankful you don't have to do. Joseph is thrust in this household, forced to do this labor against his own will. It would be completely understandable to us if Joseph had just shut down entirely, if he just tuned out what had happened to him. He has faced a whole lot of trauma in just a short amount of time. His whole life has been completely turned upside down, so it would make perfect sense for him to let that pain and that anger and that frustration and that confusion envelop him. But that's not what Joseph does. See, instead, Joseph seems to do everything he can to try to make the best out of the situation that he's been forced into. There's something about him, there's something about his character and his integrity as a person that even though he didn't choose this for himself, and even though this is not what he wanted in his life, he's going to make the best out of this situation. So he works hard. And he becomes successful in what he does. But Joseph doesn't do it on his own. Verse 2 gives us indication that Joseph had quite a lot of help here. It says, "The Lord was with Joseph. He became a successful man serving in the household of his Egyptian master." In spite of everything that has just taken place in Joseph's life, in spite of all of the upheaval that he has faced in a short amount of time, God hasn't left him. God has not abandoned him. It's probably felt like it, let's be honest. But God is still with him. When everything seems hopeless, when everything seems chaotic, when everything seems like it's a disaster, God is still with him. What a great part of that story. And because Joseph works hard and because God blesses that hard work, Joseph finds himself in a very short amount of time being promoted to more and more positions of power and influence in this household. He becomes a pretty important figure. And before too long, verses 3 and 4 indicate that Joseph caught the attention of somebody rather important. It says, "When his master saw the Lord was with him and that the Lord made everything he did successful, Joseph found favor with his master and became his personal attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household and placed all that he owned under his authority." See, because Joseph didn't shut down and completely fall apart and let himself become an emotional disaster, in spite of the fact that the situation would have been totally understandable for us to see him do that, Because he tried to make the best out of a situation, and God blessed him through that, Potiphar noticed and began to give Joseph more and more responsibility in the household. And before too awful long, Joseph runs the household of this very important man. Now, this is something that we need to kind of understand here. It's not like he's just in charge of a small staff. Potiphar is one of the most important men in Egypt. So it's likely that he has one of the biggest households in Egypt with dozens and dozens of servants working for him. And he has just placed Joseph in charge of all of them. It's now Joseph's responsibility to make sure that everything in the household runs as smoothly as it can. There's not a cup that gets taken from the cupboard and put onto a table Joseph doesn't know about. And Joseph must have been one of the best managers of all time. Like, he must have been a manager that everybody loved to work for, because the first part of verse 6 gives us an indication of just how much trust Potiphar placed in him. It says that he left all that he owned under Joseph's authority. He did not concern himself with anything except for the food he ate. That is a lot of trust. Right? I don't know about you, but I really wish that I had somebody running all my stuff, and all I had to worry about was what was for dinner. That'd be amazing. Like, to have that kind of low stress that I could just kick back. Hey, he's got it. I don't need to worry about it. That's the kind of respect that Joseph commanded in that household, all because Potiphar took notice of him, because Joseph's work ethic and not shutting down, even though the situation would have been completely understandable, it got Potiphar's attention. But it wasn't just Potiphar who Joseph was able to take attention from. See, the last part of verse 6 gives us kind of a unusual situation. Like, if you take a step back and you look at it in a vacuum, it's kind of an odd thing for it to say. The end of verse 6 says, "Now Joseph was well-built and handsome." So I suppose if you need some sort of model to figure out what did Joseph look like, I mean, I guess I'll do. Joseph and I had the same problems. It's never the case. Anyway, Joseph was he's a good-looking fella. He had muscles. He was somebody who girls were more than happy to look at. He turned more than a few heads. But there was one head in particular that I'm betting even Joseph wished he hadn't turned. There was one person who paid attention to Joseph that he probably wished really would have just left it be. The wife of his master. Verse 7 tells us, after some time, his master's wife, looked longingly at Joseph and said, "Sleep with me." It's a bit forward for my taste. At least buy me dinner first. But that's how attractive she found Joseph. That right away she's ready to go to bed with this guy who she doesn't know. Now, there's something I think we need to understand here, because when we look at this sort of thing, we think, how could she want to cheat on her husband like that? But we need to understand a little bit of Egyptian politics here. Okay, Potiphar is one of the most important men in the country. And I'm sure you pay at least enough attention to the politics around us to know that there aren't a whole lot of congressmen's wives who are unattractive. Right? Potiphar, as one of the most important men and most powerful men in Egypt, is not going to be seen married to just anybody. If anything, he's going to be married to somebody who's going to showcase just what kind of status he has in this country. So it's entirely possible that his wife is one of the most beautiful women in the entire country of Egypt. She's absolutely gorgeous. She likely won a few, beauty pageants growing up. But they probably didn't get married because of Potiphar's love for her. They probably didn't get married because Potiphar just adored her with everything that he had within him. She probably didn't marry him because Potiphar is just such a great guy. He married her so that he could look good in public events. She married him because he had power and money. But again, she is drop-dead gorgeous. And so when she approaches Joseph and tells him, "Sleep with me," I'm betting that it was more than a little tempting for him, as it would be for most men. So would Joseph make a decision? See, in this particular moment, he had an opportunity, one that's probably not going to come around much in his life. He can go to bed with his absolutely gorgeous woman. He can do what almost every red-blooded man would do in that particular moment. But if he does that, then he knows he's going to violate the trust that Potiphar has placed in him. He knows that he's going to violate the law of God, who has stuck with him in spite of these terrible circumstances thrust upon him. So yeah, he could do this, or he could choose to be a man of integrity. He could choose to be a man who holds to his principles. Even though this temptation is so great, he could choose to say no. And frankly, would the story of Joseph be remembered if he had said yes? We see what he says in verses 8 and 9. It says, "But he refused. Look," he said to his master's wife, "with me, my master does not concern himself with anything in his house. He has put all that he owns under my authority. No one in this house is greater than I am. He has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. So how could I do this immense evil? How could I sin against God?" You know, as a quick aside, in the world that we currently live in, where consent is something that seems to be debated over and over again, I think that there's a lot our world could learn from Joseph in this particular moment. Because Joseph just doesn't flat out tell her no. He tells her no, and here's a whole list of reasons why. Each and every one of them are valid points. I'm going to say no to you, and I'm going to tell you exactly why I'm saying no to you. There is no dispute as to whether or not Joseph is consenting in this particular moment. He lays it all out that there's too much to lose if he takes her up on her offer. I'm going to imagine that it was, in fact, tempting to Joseph. But in this particular moment, when a lot of guys probably wouldn't stand with the integrity, Joseph holds to his principles. He maintains his purity and tells her no in a way that anybody could understand. But she's gorgeous. And she's married to one of the most powerful men in the nation. So chances are, she's not really used to people telling her no. And now she has this upstart young Hebrew man telling her no. And that doesn't really sit well with her. In fact, as we continue on, in verse 10 it says that although she spoke to Joseph day after day, she entices him every single day. He still refused to go to bed with her. Again, this beautiful woman throws herself at Joseph every single day. And every single day, Joseph says, "No, I'm not doing this." This is a man whose faith and his principles and his integrity are unheard of in the history of the world, let alone in the kind of over-sexualized world that we live in today. She makes one final play for him, and I got to tell you, this is a doozy of a play. But Joseph probably should have suspected something was up by the time we get to verse 11. It says that now one day he went into the house to do his work, and none of the household servants were there. Like I said, there are probably dozens of people who work for Potiphar. They probably work around the clock for him. And yet this day when Joseph shows up for work, suddenly everybody decided to take a sick day? Because nobody's there. Can you imagine how eerie that situation is? Like, imagine that you went into work and you were it. I mean, it happens. I mean, it's just me and Peggy right now, but there's nothing creepier than an empty church, by the way, an empty dark church, if you've ever wondered that. Like, it's unsettling. But, if you worked in a factory job, imagine you showed up for work and nobody else was there. Something's off. But Joseph soon discovered that he's not alone, because she is there. And she goes after him hard. The first part of verse 12 says, she grabbed him by his garment and said, "Sleep with me." Take a step back. Okay? Let's look at this entire situation. For quite some time now, this beautiful woman has been throwing herself at Joseph. You got to think that at a certain point in time, constantly saying no is getting hard to do. Right? She's, again, a looker. Let's just go with that. And now, nobody's there. Who's going to find out about it? It's only going to be him and her. They're the only ones who are ever going to know exactly what's going on in this particular moment. Right? This has got to be the single most tempting moment of Joseph's life. And I got to tell you, Joseph's reaction is one of my all-time favorite moments in all of Scripture. Like, if you think about that for a second, and all the things that take place in Scripture, this particular moment stands out in my head, because I think it's one of the most unique moments in all of human history. When we read the rest of verse 12, it says, "But leaving his garment in her hand, he escaped and ran outside." That is a man of principle. He faces this huge temptation with this beautiful woman literally throwing herself at him. And instead of standing there and trying to resist it, instead of standing there and trying to have the willpower to tell her no, dude takes off. He just runs away from her. This is not a cowardly act. This is a man of integrity, realizing this temptation is probably a little bit more than I can bear, so I'm going to remove myself situation by removing myself from the situation and running away from her. He is facing a temptation that almost every single man alive is probably going to fall into. Gentlemen, can we be real honest about that? Is that okay? If we're Joseph's age, and we got a beautiful woman saying this to us, resistance is going to be difficult. And so how Joseph resists is just straight up run away from that temptation. What if we did that? What if we did that? See, I don't know about you. I can only speak for myself. But I know that I face the same temptations over and over and over again. Right? I don't often find myself to be tempted to try new sin. Right? I don't wake up in the morning and say, well, I stole something yesterday. I think I'll try killing a guy today. That doesn't happen. In fact, I find myself facing the same exact temptations over and over and over and over again. And yeah, sometimes I'm able to say no. Sometimes I'm able to resist it. Sometimes I'm able to have the willpower and the strength to say, I ain't doing that today. But far too often I collapse. My principles go out the window, and I do things that I know are wrong. I do things that I know God doesn't want me to do. My willpower fades. I'm guessing that each and every one of us in this room could probably say the same thing. That as much as we don't want it to, as much as we don't want it to happen, sometimes those temptations get the best of us. We sin. We do things that we know hurt our Heavenly Father. But what if we looked at the story of Joseph and we looked at what he did here, where he hated the notion of sinning against God so very much that when he faces this major temptation in his life, he actually physically removes himself from that situation entirely. where he resists temptation to the point he flees from sin. What if we did that? What if we were to actually make that happen? I think if we did that, it would have a dramatic effect on our relationship with God. I mean, how could it not, right? We are literally running away from things that get in between us and God. When we choose to flee from those temptations, when we choose to flee from sin, we are running towards the arms of our Father. Because we value having that relationship with Him over having a few moments of pleasure. Things that we think are going to be good for us, but ultimately end up in disaster. See, every Christian knows that we're supposed to be free from sin, or at least we're trying to do our best to stay away from sin, and yet, do we hate it that much? Do we hate it so much that we're willing to run from it? See, Joseph placed such a high level of his integrity with God that when he was faced with a temptation that so many different men fall into, instead of standing there and trying to say no, instead of trying to have that willpower, he literally ran away from it. Like, I just can't get past that fact. He literally ran away from it. We live in a culture and a society where it seems like running away is a coward's move. We think that we have to stand there and have the willpower and the strength and the courage to say no. But let me ask you a question. How's that working out for you? Too many of us think we got to be John Wayne. Right? We got to be the rough and tough guy who can resist any temptation that comes our way with nothing but grit. What if we tried a different way? Because I don't know about you, but the whole grit thing, it's not working out too well for me. So what if we tried this approach of Joseph? Joseph had this opportunity, an opportunity that was never going to come again in his life. Nobody was going to find out about it. This is that moment where, she's telling him, hey, my parents aren't home. Do you want to come over? Or, hey, we're alone in the back seat of this car. Or, hey, there's nobody else in the movie theater. And instead, he chose to run away from it, to put actual distance between him and sin. And I got to tell you, I find that heroic. I don't think there's anything cowardly about hating sin so much you literally run away when it's tempting you. So what does that look like for us? What does running away from these situations look like in our instance? Well, maybe it means you need to turn the computer off at a certain hour of the night. Maybe it means you need to turn the television off at a certain hour at night. Maybe it means you got to give your wife your phone when she goes to bed. Maybe it means you need to take a different route home. Maybe it means you need to find a new job. It might mean 100 different things for you. Actually put physical distance between you and sin, I think, is going to draw you closer to the heart of God than you've ever been before. Rather than trying to stand up against it like some sort of superhero. Maybe instead we need to do the most heroic thing we can think of and actually run away from it. 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, "No temptation has come upon you except that what is common to humanity. But God is faithful. He won't allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but the temptation He will provide a way out so that you may be able to bear it." What if the easiest way that God gave us as a way away from temptation was to literally run away from it? In those particular moments, we always have a choice to leave. Right? We always have the opportunity to leave a situation. What if that's the easiest way for us to avoid that temptation? What if that is God's exit for us? It's to just turn and walk away, or maybe just straight up run away. Why do we got to make things more complicated than that? Joseph was a man of integrity. He ran away from temptation, and again, I told you, this is probably my favorite part of his entire story. So what if we tried that? Because as much as I would love to tell you, right now I've gotten really good at running away from things, I still have that voice in my head that says I got to fight this myself. So what if we tried something different? What if we tried a new tactic to run away from the things that tempt us into sin? Paul tells us in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 11 this, and we're going to close with it. But you, man of God, flee from these things. Pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, and gentleness. What if he meant that? What if when he says flee from it, he actually meant flee?